What's good? It's Wood. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I want to go through what I consider to be Manny Pacquiao's 5 best wins. So I'm not talking the greatest wins, like the biggest legacy establishing wins necessarily, but I'm talking about his 5 best wins, meaning it's a combination between the quality of his performance, the quality of his opponent, but also where that opponent was in their career. And then the final thing is the significance of the win. So those things combined, quality of performance, quality of opponent, where that opponent was in their career trajectory, and then significance of the win. And before I get into the main 5, I want to kick off 3 honorable mentions that didn't make my top 5 best Manny Pacquiao wins, but they came damn close. The first one is Manny Pacquiao versus Juan Manuel Marquez 2. And this fight took place in 2008. They had fought for the first time back in 2004. They fought to a split draw. This was the fight where in the first round, and by the way, this was just after Manny Pacquiao's breakthrough win against Marco Antonio Barrera, the 11th round TKO stoppage. So right after that, 2004, Manny Pacquiao fought Juan Manuel Marquez for the first time, and he knocked him down 3 times in the first round. After that, Marquez totally neutralized Manny Pacquiao, won most of the rounds going forward. It ended up being a draw. So that was a momentary halt to this tidal wave of momentum that Manny Pacquiao was bringing in after, becoming a multi-division champion, beating Ledwaba, winning several fights on notable undercards. This is when he still had the dyed hair, the blonde streaks in kind of his wild hair. So you see this little Filipino dude just working people into the corner, into the ropes, and just beating the hell out of them, stopping them. It was pretty electrifying. So yeah, his big coming out party was against Barrera. Then he fights Marquez to a draw. So that was a little bit disappointing, but we knew that Marquez was a skilled technician. His legacy would only grow from that point forward. But 4 years after that first Pacquiao versus Marquez fight, they have the rematch. And this is after Manny Pacquiao has had a ton of success, beating other guys, and then he comes back. This ends up being a classic, super close fight, very high stakes. This fight was just, if I could point you to any one Pacquiao versus Marquez fight, even including the 4th fight where Marquez finally gets the win over Pacquiao via brutal one-punch knockout, I would point you to Pacquiao versus Marquez 2. It just totally embodies the back-and-forth nature of their longtime rivalry. And Manny Pacquiao pulled out that win in the rematch via split decision win. Super close fight, but it was a big-time hurdle that Manny Pacquiao needed to clear given their draw a few years prior before moving forward. The second honorable mention I want to shout out is Manny Pacquiao versus Timothy Bradley 3. This was actually Manny Pacquiao's first fight after his finally fighting Floyd Mayweather in 2015. This fight took place a few years later than it probably should have, given their career trajectories. This happened way later than it should have. But the first fight after that, unanimous decision loss for Pacquiao against Mayweather was against Bradley. This was the rubber match. Bradley had won a close and controversial decision win over Pacquiao in their first fight. Pacquiao returns the favor and beats Bradley in the rematch via unanimous decision. So this fight is the rubber match, and Pacquiao beats Timothy Bradley. Could be a future Hall of Famer, we'll see, but Pacquiao beats Bradley more authoritatively than he did in the second fight. So this pretty much punctuated the 3-fight rivalry between Pacquiao and Timothy Bradley. He also being Pacquiao, scored multiple knockdowns of Bradley in that fight as well. Now the third honorable mention fight, and this one could have very well made the top 5 greatest Pacquiao wins, best Manny Pacquiao wins. And that was 2009's Manny Pacquiao victory over Ricky Hatton. This is kind of an iconic fight. This is Manny Pacquiao's first fight since the biggest turning point of his career, basically fighting the Golden Goose at the time, which was Oscar De La Hoya. Manny Pacquiao, after that huge win over De La Hoya, fights Ricky Hatton. This fight wasn't for one of the 4 major titles at junior welterweight, 140. This was actually just for the IBO title and for the ring title. But given the quality of Ricky Hatton as an opponent, even with that first and at the time only loss against Floyd Mayweather, it was him versus the surging Manny Pacquiao. They clashed. The odds were actually pretty close on this fight. The odds were Manny Pacquiao as a -225 favorite. So he was a favorite, but it wasn't like a 4-1, 6-1. This was, thought to be, we got to see how this fight unfolds. And it ended up not being competitive at all. This fight underscored the developments that Manny Pacquiao had been making over the years under the tutelage of Freddie Roach. This fight just showed how complete of a package Pacquiao was, not only as a devastating puncher because he apparently was bringing the power up weight classes. Manny Pacquiao was fighting in the very, very low weight classes, ends up getting stronger as he goes up through 126, then 130, had one fight against David Diaz at lightweight, only one lightweight fight, and then he fights De La Hoya at a much higher weight class, then comes back to 140 to fight Ricky Hatton, and he knocks Ricky Hatton out cold in the second round. One punch knockout. He had dropped him in the first round, but he put his lights out in the second round with a beautiful punch. This was pretty shocking. This kind of hushed the entire boxing world. Like, we went from saying, damn, which we had said already up to this point several times throughout Manny Pacquiao's career, but this one might have been the most resounding damn, where it's almost like the boxing landscape needed to take a moment of silence to recognize what was going on. This was a brutal knockout of Ricky Hatton in 2009. So let's get right into the top 5 best wins for Manny Pacquiao. And I'm going to actually list these in chronological order from earliest to latest. So you go through Manny Pacquiao's career. He had won a title early in his career. He beat Ledwaba on the way up. For the super bantamweight title, that's 122. And then he fights Marco Antonio Barrera. This was a major HBO fight. Huge showdown through this surging multi-divisional champion, but still kind of seen as a surging prospect in Manny Pacquiao because he had yet to totally capture the boxing world by storm. But Marco Antonio Barrera was already a certified legend. He had already had his first 2 huge fights against Eric Morales at this point. So this is all the way back in 2003. And the legend Barrera takes on this scary up-and-comer who was, again, how can you be an up-and-comer when you're already a multi-divisional champ? But I'm just saying, comparatively speaking, it was Barrera who was the resounding A-side, and it was Pacquiao who still had something to prove. And Pacquiao stopped Barrera, the legend, in the 11th round. The first couple rounds started off being pretty competitive, but as the fight continued, yes, Barrera would show his trademark heart several times in the fight and would battle back, but Pacquiao's speed, his volume, his footwork, he was just electrifying, plus the power just proved to be way too much for Marco Antonio Barrera to handle. This was Pacquiao's first absolute breakthrough moment. Yeah, if you didn't know, now you know. And this was his 3rd divisional championship win. This was at featherweight. But you know what? Let me actually dial that back. This wasn't even for a major official title. This was for the ring, unofficial but very credible title at featherweight. So he had yet to capture his 3rd divisional title win. But this was by far his most significant win to date against the legend Barrera. And then 3 years later, 2006, the next fight that belongs in the top 5 best wins for Manny Pacquiao in his illustrious career is his 2nd fight, the rematch against Eric Morales. Now, after Pacquiao beat Barrera, he then fought to a draw, as I mentioned, against Juan Manuel Marquez, and then he fights Perang. Not a very notable fighter. He knocked Perang out in the 4th round, and then he fights Eric Morales, another legend. And this is basically the next proving ground that Manny Pacquiao had on his way to stardom. So he fights Eric Morales. This turns out to be a sensational fight. I mean, they were both pretty bloodied up. This was just back and forth. Brutal fight. Pacquiao ended up receiving a big cut that kind of changed the complexion of the fight. Eric Morales ends up beating Manny Pacquiao via unanimous decision in their first bout. And this is 2005. So then Pacquiao beats Hector Velasquez via 6-round TKO, and then he takes on Eric Morales in the rematch. And this ends up being probably the greatest Manny Pacquiao fight I had ever seen up to this point, at least. It's up there with the greatest fights in Manny Pacquiao's career. I just rewatched this fight like a couple weeks ago. This was outstanding. You know, there were points in the early and even middle rounds where you listen to the commentary and momentum has shifted back to Eric Morales, and he's just outclassing Pacquiao like in 3 consecutive rounds, like rounds 2 through 4 or 3 through 5, to where it looked like Pacquiao was kind of falling behind on the scorecards. And again, remember, Eric Morales beat Pacquiao in the first fight. So imagine the change in career trajectory if Pacquiao were to lose this rematch against Morales. So the stakes were so high here, but Pacquiao started battling back, putting those combinations together, the laser-like hand speed. They were, you know, him and Freddie Roach had been working on developing his right hand, his lead hand, because he's a southpaw. They were working on his Manila Ice right hand punch to be able to mix it up and to give Morales all these looks. But by the middle to late rounds, it was clear Morales did not have an answer for Manny Pacquiao's straight left hand. And Manny Pacquiao was not afraid to use that damn thing. He threw that punch time and time again, kept on rocking Morales. But Morales was super durable, had the chin of granite, just an unbreakable fighter. Well, guess what? In the rematch between, you know, it was billed as Morales versus Pacquiao, because remember, Morales won the first one. In this rematch, that chin finally broke, and Manny Pacquiao knocked out Eric Morales in the 10th round. TKO win for Manny Pacquiao. Huge, huge career trajectory setting or reclaiming of that upward trajectory. Because again, if he loses this rematch, you're now 0-2 against Eric Morales. Needless to say, the Manny Pacquiao story would have probably been very different if he didn't come through with that TKO win over the legend Morales in their rematch. They actually fought a third time after that later on that same year, and by then, Eric Morales' chin was not as durable as it was for the first and second fight. Manny Pacquiao stopped Eric Morales in the 3rd round in that 3rd fight. But it's the 2nd fight, the rematch, that I'm placing in the top 5 best wins of Manny Pacquiao's career. The next fight that I want to include here is just 2 years later. This was when he started to kind of skip weights, and he ended up fighting David Diaz at like 135. Again, that's his one fight at lightweight, and then he jumped multiple weight classes to take on Oscar De La Hoya at 147. De La Hoya, he ended up losing way too much weight, and it ended up looking like it kind of exhausted him. But I wanted to include this fight because this is probably, just like it was for Floyd Mayweather, this was you're here in terms of public perception and just public awareness. But when you beat the golden goose, that is the golden boy at the time for that era, for that long stretch of the era, Oscar De La Hoya was the guy that everybody wanted to fight. Manny Pacquiao finally gets that opportunity, and this was the only fight out of all the fights that I've mentioned thus far where Manny Pacquiao was an underdog. This, because he was steamrolling through 126 and 122 before that. He had those great fights. He had that great win against Barrera. He had those 3 fights against Eric Morales. He's looking like a legend, although a boxing famous legend, but not a world famous legend quite yet. He had already avenged that draw versus Marquez with the split decision win in their rematch. I was just talking about that fight earlier. Beats David Diaz, and then he fights Oscar De La Hoya, and the odds are against Manny Pacquiao because he is so out of his element at 147. It's like, what are you doing in this part of town? You belong down at 126, maybe 130. You had the one fight at 135, but is the power going to go up all the way to 147? And you're fighting the legendary Oscar De La Hoya, who not too long ago fought Floyd Mayweather in that split decision loss, but a very competitive fight against Floyd. I mean, that fight was like one round, 2 rounds, give or take, could have been the difference between who wins, Mayweather versus De La Hoya, or should I say De La Hoya versus Mayweather, because again, De La Hoya was the golden goose, the A side of the era. Manny Pacquiao fights Oscar De La Hoya, and this fight is not close. It is not competitive. Oscar De La Hoya could barely lay a glove on Pacquiao, and it looked like Pacquiao could not miss Oscar De La Hoya. This was one-way traffic. And for anybody who had any questions on how high could Manny Pacquiao's power carry? Well, check this out. He, unlike, Shane Mosley in his 2 fights versus Oscar, or Floyd Mayweather, the only other fighter to stop Oscar De La Hoya was Bernard Hopkins with the body shot, and that was up at 160. So Manny Pacquiao stopped Oscar De La Hoya from being he was an underdog. Again, what were the exact lines? It was Manny Pacquiao was a plus 160 underdog against Oscar, and he ends up stopping Oscar De La Hoya in the 8th round. Basically, Oscar quit in the corner because, by the end of that fight, Oscar De La Hoya had to grab onto the rope to kind of steady himself. He buckled a couple times, kind of buckled into the turnbuckle, while Manny Pacquiao was just relentlessly letting his hands go. He hit Oscar with everything but the kitchen sink. This fight actually shows not only how great of a fighter Pacquiao was entering that stage of his career, but also how resilient and durable Oscar De La Hoya's chin is. I don't know who else could have held up with getting hit by Manny Pacquiao that often for that long. Oscar De La Hoya, not only is he one of the greatest fighters of the era in any weight class, but he's got one of the most underrated chins in boxing history. Ask yourself, when have you seen Oscar De La Hoya really get his lights put out or get dropped where it's I don't know if he could continue? Even when he got dropped against Ike Quartey, he was all right. He was able to get back and fight his way back into it. We have never seen Oscar De La Hoya totally obliterated with shots to the face up top. But Manny Pacquiao got about as close as you can to just putting Oscar's lights out. He didn't do it. In fact, I don't think he even dropped Oscar, but he was just pelting him. And, the commentary, it was kind of sad to watch. A fight this non-competitive that involved Oscar De La Hoya. And this fight, unlike, the great wins of Pacquiao's past, this fight truly launched Manny Pacquiao into superstar status. Basically, after you beat Oscar, the rest is history. You know what I mean? But he would go on, obviously, for the next 13 years. No one would have guessed that. But this was kind of that turning point, just like it was for Floyd Mayweather a couple years prior. So after that win over De La Hoya, Manny Pacquiao then, as I said, put Ricky Hatton's lights out, and then he fights the great Miguel Cotto, who at this point had only one loss in his career, and it was that very controversial, bludgeoning, bloody bloodbath, terrible fight to watch if you are a Miguel Cotto fan against Antonio Margarito. Cotto versus Margarito won. Rewatch that fight. There's a lot of controversy in that one. Margarito was exposed as a cheater, loading his gloves in the years to come. So this fight, you almost might want to put an asterisk by Cotto's loss against Margarito. But even if you were to reverse that official outcome of the fight, call it a no contest or a DQ, the damage was done. You know what I mean? You cannot truly be yourself after a beating like that. Now, Cotto would go on to do a whole bunch of great things throughout his career, but that fight against Margarito did make a difference for Cotto. So Pacquiao, after beating De La Hoya, then knocking out Ricky Hatton, fights Miguel Cotto in 2009. This was thought to be a super competitive fight. Again, Manny Pacquiao is just on this steamroll. He's got all this momentum going for him, and he's going against an outstanding Miguel Cotto. So, a lot of people thought this was kind of a pick'em. Yes, Manny Pacquiao was a favorite in this fight, but everybody who knew Miguel Cotto knew, hey man, this is going to be interesting, especially because this was at welterweight. This wasn't at 135, 130, 126. And unlike De La Hoya, who in retrospect probably shouldn't have been losing all that weight to cut back down to 147 for the Pacquiao fight, Miguel Cotto was a solid 147 by this point. And, this was a competitive fight, but Pacquiao dropped him in, I think, the second round or the third round, and then in the following round. So Pacquiao knocked Miguel Cotto down twice in, the first 4 rounds. Shocking if you're the viewer. It's holy hell, how good is Manny Pacquiao? And then as the fight went on, yes, Cotto found his moments to stay competitive, to beat Pacquiao up a bit. Cotto was getting his too. This did have a lot of back and forth moments where, Pacquiao would do the thing where he's up against the ropes, and we've seen Manny Pacquiao do this several times against Marquez, against Morales, where he gets hit, then he beats his chest, hits his head, and raises his hands. It's almost like that's a signal, oh, you done messed up. Now, here comes Manny, because he's going to respond to what he just took in the incoming fire. And so there was a lot of that with Cotto versus Pacquiao. But as the fight progressed into the middle rounds, Cotto could not withstand the onslaught, the continuous onslaught that was Manny Pacquiao's offense. And he was only becoming more and more of a sweet science guy too. Like, he was putting all of the tools together. So not only is he a freak athlete with out of this world enormous talent, but he's also just getting better and better as a boxer, counterpunching better head movement, better footwork, better defense, all these different things, better ring generalship, better at picking his spots and when to exchange. He's just becoming a complete package, and it was no more evident than it was in Manny Pacquiao versus Miguel Cotto. He ended up stopping Miguel Cotto in the 12th round, the final round of the fight. Again, this fight was 2009, and right after the fight, I forgot who asked who, between, Lampley and some combination of either Emmanuel Stewart, the late, great Emmanuel Stewart, Larry Merchant, or Max Kellerman. I think Kellerman might have had that call. But one person asked the other, so do you like, because they were already talking about Manny Pacquiao versus, Floyd. By this point, this was 2009. Keep in mind, Manny Pacquiao and Floyd would not end up fighting until 2015. This is 6 years after Manny Pacquiao versus Miguel Cotto, which is a damn travesty. But one commentator asked the other, so do you think Manny Pacquiao has a realistic shot at beating Floyd? And then the other person responded, yep. Nothing else needed to be said, because we just watched Manny Pacquiao annihilate Miguel Cotto. At the end of the day, stopped him and just, outclassed him. And, it has to be said, this was also a part of that controversial part of Manny Pacquiao's career, where there are a significant amount of boxing fans who don't think that Manny Pacquiao was totally on the up and up in terms of what he was taking. Freddie Roach even, said at one point, I don't know what Ariza, Manny Pacquiao's strength and conditioning coach, was giving him in certain drinks. Couple that with, Manny Pacquiao's refusal to abide by the types of, drug checks that Floyd Mayweather was calling for and saying was the sticking point in that fight not being made for several years. So there's a lot of controversy that's kind of attached specifically to this juncture of Manny Pacquiao's career. Basically, when he started moving up weight, David Diaz and then De La Hoya, through the point where he stopped or beat Antonio Margarito via unanimous decision, or, Josh Clottey and then Shane Mosley. We're talking up until like 2010, 2011, basically. There are a lot of people who question Pacquiao's career between, say, 2007, 2008, and then up to 2011. But performance-wise, this was, to me, the greatest of Manny Pacquiao. This was when he was at the peak of his powers. You just did not want to be in the ring with him. And that included this fight against Miguel Cotto. Amazing performance for Manny Pacquiao. And then the final fight that I'm including in the top 5 best wins of Manny Pacquiao's career, you've got to fast forward 10 years to 2019, and that is Manny Pacquiao's most recent fight against Keith Thurman, then undefeated, former 2-time welterweight champion. Keith Thurman, one time. Yes, he had significant layoffs. Yes, you could argue Keith Thurman hasn't ever been the same since his shoulder injury and his hand injury and his inactivity, basically after beating Sean Porter and then Danny Garcia. Keith Thurman for a couple years was looking like the man at 147 and one of the best fighters pound for pound in the sport. Keith Thurman was that good for a certain window of time. And then he comes back from a significant layoff, like almost 2 years, fights Josecito Lopez, where Keith Thurman got hurt in a way that we had never seen Keith Thurman hurt throughout his career. He didn't get dropped, but he got hit to the point where he looked like he was out on his feet and was unable to defend himself for like the next minute or two, where he's just walking backwards. And every time Josecito Lopez would hit him, Keith Thurman's head would fly back. It was the worst round or two that we had ever seen in Keith Thurman's career. But he ended up winning that fight against Josecito Lopez via unanimous decision, and then Keith Thurman fights Manny Pacquiao. who by this point had completed the Bradley trilogy, had those 4 fights with Marquez, had in recent years, very recent years, like, a year or 2 prior, 3 years prior, had fought, Floyd Mayweather, lost that one, but he beat Lucas Matisse, beat Adrian Broner. A couple years prior to that, he had a controversial loss against Jeff Horn, beat Jesse Vargas, beat Chris Algieri. So Manny Pacquiao is outside of his absolute prime, and he's now nearing 40 years old. So he's 40 by the time he fights Keith Thurman. So we're basically just happy to even see that Manny Pacquiao is still competing, and he's still competing at a very high level. How high a level? Tough to tell, because he's beating Adrian Broner, a very good fighter, and beat Lucas Matisse just before that. But now he's fighting Keith Thurman, one of the most dangerous and most complete fighters at 147, and Manny Pacquiao drops Keith Thurman in the first round. It was amazing, stunning to see. And he ends up hurting Keith Thurman again, like in the 5th round. He hit him with a body shot that got Keith Thurman to basically take his mouthpiece out, say, F that, I need to survive, as he's like circling the perimeter of the ring, trying to buy time because he's hurt that badly in the middle rounds. Well, Keith Thurman battled back. It ended up being a very competitive fight where Keith Thurman ended up winning a few of those rounds. But Manny Pacquiao was awarded a split decision win over Keith Thurman, giving Keith Thurman the first and to this day only loss of his career, and that is Manny Pacquiao's most recent fight. Unbelievable. 40 years old, beating Keith Thurman. So yeah, let me know what you think are Manny Pacquiao's best wins. The best wins of Manny Pacquiao's career. Let me know what you think. Please leave your comments in the comments. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.